Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Effectively Manage the Modern Risks of Open Source Code. As we've been writing in SD Times, the use of open source code in modern applications has literally exploded. Some surveys have shown that upwards of 90% of the code in today's applications are open source components. Yet most organizations have not done a good job of knowing which components are being used, where they originated, and what their impact is on the organization in terms of both creating vulnerabilities and even creating some licensing issues. Today, we'll be discussing this, as well as how to identify open source with confidence, minimize risk, prioritize remediation when issues arise, and a lot more. So with me today are Stephen Gates. He's a security evangelist and senior solution specialist at Checkmarks, and James Bratsos, product manager for developer experience at Checkmarks. So before we get started, I just have a couple of quick announcements. First, today's webinar will be followed by a live Q&A session. So to ask a question, simply navigate to the tab in your control panel, type it in, and we'll get to as many as time will allow. Secondly, the session's being recorded and will be available on demand on the sdtimes.com website, probably by first thing tomorrow. So without any further ado, let's get started. I'm going to turn it on over to Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen.
All right, thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. And so we've got some interesting topic today about open source, and I'm going to start off with the current state of open source software. Sort of give you the general state of what we observe right here at Checkmarks, and then I'm going to be handing it over to James Bratsos, where he's going to be getting a much more technical, a little bit deeper dive into STA and really what it's all about. So without further ado, let's get into this. So, we hear it all the time, right? Just like David mentioned, 90%, 90% of the organizations they've surveyed are actually, admitting that open source is finding its way into their code base. And, the security is one of the most significant challenges when consuming open source. That's obviously at the top of everyone's list. The vulnerable components are open windows to hackers who can easily exploit them. Why? It's because they're open source, they're available, right? And many times, hackers can go in and find vulnerabilities and various, various packages or various projects out there and definitely find ways of exploiting them. And really, it expands the risk landscape beyond just vulnerability risk. For so many years in the world of application security testing, it's always been about, dealing with the vulnerabilities that, our developers created, right? And now that we're talking about open source, that it certainly broadens that risk landscape. And now we've got to consider license risk, and we also have to consider operational risk, which we call technical debt. And this is really based upon projects or packages that are no longer being necessarily supported by the open source community, all right? And that they happen to find their way into your code base, who's actually responsible for them at that point. An interesting thing here is that Gartner, according to their research, concerns about security vulnerabilities such as use of untrusted third-party components, lack of vendor accountability, 28% say that's number one, right? That's the number one concern around open source. So also according to the research, here at Checkmarks, we do a lot of work with an organization called ESG, and according to their research, some interesting statistics as well. Number one, the time pressures are often lead to the use of third-party components, right? And developers, it's time to market. We got to get these releases out as fast as possible. That's one of the reasons why developers choose, to select these third-party components. And from this statistic, 80% report significant use of open source software in their code base. And 43% actually are stating more than half of their code base is composed of open source. Now, the interesting thing too is that 49% of that same group who report that a quarter or more of their code base is open source have invested in controls to scan that code for vulnerabilities, which is very positive, right? That would be a very bad statistic if it was like 2 or 3%, right? So hopefully, 50% is actually quite good. And then there's another 44% of those who report 25% or more of their code base is open source, plan to invest in security controls over the next 12 months. So it tells us really that, you're not the only one that's concerned about open source. There's a lot of organizations that are concerned about open source as well. Now, this is also an interesting statistic from ESG. It's probably one of my favorites, actually, is that pushing code with known vulnerabilities. 79% of the respondents shared that their organizations regularly or occasionally push code to production with known organic vulnerabilities. And the interesting thing is that 54% of the people actually cite that it's based upon meeting a critical deadline, right? Hey, we've got a deadline, we've got to push this code to production. And it's got known vulnerabilities inside of it. The second interesting statistic is we felt the vulnerabilities had very low risk, meaning 49% of the people said, hey, we know it's vulnerable, we think the vulnerability is pretty low, let's go ahead and move to production. And then thirdly, the vulnerabilities were discovered too late in the cycle to resolve them in time, meaning there's a balance. There's a balance that we're seeing out there today with time to market versus security. And I'm sure there's lots of contention out there in the organizations today that are being pushed to internally to push code externally. So this is sort of my disclaimer, Checkmarks disclaimer, is open source safe? It really depends, right? And we're not here to throw open source under the bus. For certainly, it can be very, very safe, but there's some contingencies to it. Open source components are used everywhere, and there's situations in which open source components can be vulnerable. And this usually means understanding the difference between a vulnerable component and a vulnerable version of that component, right? There's a difference there. And then a component may contain vulnerabilities, but only in certain versions. And it's possible that a newer version may not contain the same vulnerabilities that a previous version actually did. Another interesting concept is that some components may contain their own vulnerabilities that did not exist in previous versions, since a vulnerability may have just been introduced in the latest version. And it all depends how the software is constructed and how it evolves over time, right? So there's a lot of caveats when we're talking about vulnerabilities inside of open source. And again, nothing wrong with open source. Open source is not vulnerable by nature, right? And it's not something that anybody should be afraid of. What we've got to do is be able to address it appropriately in the context of security and application security testing. So let's do a quick poll. Jennifer, can we pull up that poll number 1? Okay, so question to the audience. If you've increased your usage over open source in the past 12 months, what is the main reason for doing so? Is it more flexibility and agility, able to build applications faster, more cost effective, able to focus more on optimization and customization, or is there some other reason why you're consuming more open source than you've had in the past? So let's give a few seconds here for this. Go ahead and make your selection if you'd like. I would definitely enjoy just taking a brief pause here. Okay, so let's wrap that up real quick, Jennifer, and let's show the results. And it looks like my results are a little bit smaller than what I hoped. Let's see here. Well, it looks like the second one, which is able to build applications faster, is one of the number one reasons why. That's actually why we're seeing open source has increased dramatically in the last 12 months. All right, so let's close that poll, Jennifer, and let's go back to the slide deck. All right, so moving on. Now, SCA market trends according to the leading analysts. Now, a lot of people in the world of security obviously look to the analysts for guidance. And according to Gartner, by 2023, more than 70% of the enterprise DevSecOps initiatives will have incorporated automated security vulnerability and configuration scanning, basically software composition analysis, a long-term, and commercial packages, which is a significant increase from fewer than 30 in 2019. And Forrester says that, hey, SCA will see the biggest shift of focus in the next year, as 52% of the survey respondents said that their firm will be implementing some sort of SCA solution versus 36% who have already done so. So we see there's a major trend right now where organizations are saying, look, we acknowledge the fact that we're utilizing open source. What are we going to do about it? Now, one thing I will note is that the traditional approaches simply aren't working, right? Today, security, DevOps, engineering can no longer operate in silos. Why? It's because they're all part of delivery. They're all part of that delivery process. And the integration between security, DevOps, and engineering teams are now, very, very intimate, right? They have to be able to meet these timelines. Faster time to market requirement, more automation, integration, faster feedback cycles. And James will be talking a little bit about the automation and integration capabilities of what an SCA solution should actually have. Traditional SCA solutions ignore the developer's needs and often are forcing changes to the way they work. Instead of an SCA solution that actually fits into the way they're actually developing software today, instead, many of the SCA solutions on the market change or have forced change in the organization, change in the SDLC, and that's definitely not the way to adopt an SCA solution. And the first thing that you want is developer adoption, right? With developer buy-in. And so any solution that actually impacts their workload and their work process is probably not going to fit well. And then the synergies with other ASC tools accelerate remediation timelines. And this is very, very interesting, is that some of the SCA tools out there can actually integrate very well with static application security testing, and James will talk a little bit why that's also important. And many of the SCA vendors out there really just lack a complete portfolio to do this. They may have a really fantastic SCA solution. However, there's some caveats when they are not combining it with SAST or IAST and some of the other AST solutions out there today. Now, your role in all of this is really, you have an important role, and we need to be able to bridge the gap between development and security teams. And so the recommendation is very simple, is begin to foster the conversation around open source usage and security practices within your own organization. And understand what steps are being taken to mitigate the risks, if any, and if they're effective. How are you managing the SCA conversation today, right? And beyond the conversation, how are we actually managing the security, the license risk, and the operational risk that goes along with it? The scope and level of the effort with current practices and identify inefficiencies, right? Meaning, look at how much time is being consumed in managing the security of your open source, and really determine, hey, can we do this in a much more effective means and manner? And then evaluate the risk and opportunity and cost to your organization, absence or failure of these practices. What's it going to cost your organization if, for instance, there's a data loss or a breach or something? I don't want to play doom and gloom here, but we all know that there's a huge risk, and the open source is certainly just elevating that risk in a multi-dimensional approach. So the real critical questions to ask yourself is, first off, which open source libraries are used? And do they contain any vulnerabilities? Do you know that information, and do you have access to that information at your fingertips? Am I spending my time wisely on things that will have the biggest impact? Meaning, do I know what needs to be remedied and what doesn't necessarily need to be remedied based upon how I'm using the open source in my code base? And then how do I streamline open source risk assessment and remediation? And so I think these three questions is kind of where you begin and saying, okay, if I understand the answers to these three questions, definitely I will have a better handle on the open source security risks in my own organization. So answering these critical questions about open source in your organization, how do we go about it? Well, first off, which open source libraries are used, and do they contain any vulnerabilities? So how do you answer that? Well, you have to generate a complete inventory of the open source libraries and the associated risks inside of your code base. And also tracking public CVEs and vendor exclusive vulnerabilities, especially ones that are curated by a dedicated open source security research team. Many of the vendors out there today, some of the vendors, not all the vendors, but some of the vendors out there have got a really, really excellent security research teams that are really focusing on these open source vulnerabilities and the risks that are associated with them. And also being able to accurately detect the directive transitive dependencies, the dependencies of dependencies, right? And do I understand what risks are involved there as well? And tracking new vulnerabilities to impacting previously scanned projects, right? And if I did a scan a year ago, 6 months ago, still running the same package, is it now vulnerable? Has a new vulnerability been found in that, right? And so we've got to be able to track those new vulnerabilities. And the next question, what I would want to ask is, am I spending my time wisely on the things that will have the biggest impact? And really determining whether a vulnerability is actually in the application's execution path using another AST technology. here at Checkmarks, we call that sort of the exploitable path functionality. Can I determine if a vulnerable component is actually called inside of the actual, inside of the execution path of the application? And do I have that information, and do I know whether or not I need to remediate something, or hey, it's not being called, I don't need to remediate it. Also, how a vulnerable component enters the application for effective remediation. Now, we call this dependable path, right? And so these are some real key terms: exploitable path, dependency path, and understanding. The third one as well is prioritizing remediation efforts by filtering out those libraries that are used for development but are not used in production. We call those dev dependencies. And I think James might be just touching on these real lightly in the second half of this presentation. And then the third question, how do I streamline open source risk assessment and remediation, is really discussing integrating, SCA into my CI/CD pipelines and throughout the entire SDLC. Can I do that today? And facilitate the information flow, meaning really about how do I deliver the analysis results directly into the build tools that the developers are using, right? I think that's another requirement today. When we're all talking about time to market, we're talking about streamlining security inside of the, development practices. And again, the DevOps terms are coming up all over the place, and we're adding security into DevOps, is really being able to deliver the results directly to the developer while they're developing the code. Makes a huge bit of difference in actually saving time. And also, is there a way of managing an automated ticket creation, right, into my bug tracking tools and my ticketing systems? And can I actually, run the scans and track the bugs in an automated fashion so my developers and my security teams aren't spending hours a day opening, triaging, and closing tickets, right? Because, if you look at the statistics there, they're actually very, very time consuming. And then unifying the activities for both SCA and the other application security testing tools in use. We know there's a lot of companies out there today. Most everybody is running some form of SAST, right? Static application security testing. There's a lot of DAST tools out there. There's a lot of pen testing that's going on. I mean, when you look in, some of the public sector space, still very heavily relying on penetration testing. And then also integrative application security testing, which is sort of the new kid on the block, which is IAST, and really understanding how do I unify all of these security technologies, because they all do different things at different times during the SDLC, and understanding how I can unify those activities. And then initiating a scan, see the results from one location within your build system. And James is going to be just touching on that real briefly as well in the next section. So let's move on to poll question number 2 real quick, Jessica. And this is an interesting question too, and it's just kind of your opinion, right? If your developers are increasingly using open source, if you were to advise somebody, what would the advice be concerning how best to manage the widening risk? What would you tell somebody, right? Say you're advising the key stakeholders in your organization. And would you say, A, one, acknowledge it's an issue, then move on? How about number 2, put a security policy in place that addresses open source? It's always a great place to start with security policy. What about using SAST or DAST solutions that test code for vulnerabilities? Meticulously track all open source usage in your code base, or fully implement a complete SCA solution and use it extensively? I mean, what would you advise inside of your organization of how you approach open source security? And we'll give it another minute here, and I think I just gave everybody enough time because I read those. So Jessica, let's go ahead and close that poll and show out those results. And it looks like the number 2 is pretty high on the list, right? Which is put a security policy in place. That's a great place to start. Love it when the audience answers with that. And then meticulously track all open source in your code base, which would be number 2. And it looks like organizations are getting there and fully implementing an SCA solution in the future as well. Okay, so back to the presentation, if you can, Jessica. Thank you. All right. So real quick, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Checkmarks before we move on to James' portion of this. And he's our technical subject matter expert here today. So I'm looking forward to hearing his piece of the presentation. So real quick about Checkmarks, we are the world's top organization choosing Checkmarks. Many of the world's top organizations are choosing Checkmarks to make their software more secure. Today, we've got over more than 1,500 customers worldwide, and we're actually trusted by 42 of the Fortune 100, which really is a validation of our approach and the quality of our technology. And Gartner Magic Quadrant leader in application security testing for the third consecutive year. And we keep moving further and further away from our competitors with regards to being a leader in the space. And then Forrester Wave leader in the static application security testing, and just was released last month. And then we've been experiencing 50% plus year-over-year growth deployed in 70 plus countries. Now, also, Checkmarks, we're a recognized leader in security research, right? So we've got actually 2 different research teams in our organization. And our first research team is really focused on technologies, devices, and really around the world of keeping people secure, keeping organizations secure, right? And really what we're trying to do is effectively change the way organizations out there today think and feel and operate with regards to security. And so you can see here, Google confirms an Android camera security threat, hundreds of millions of users affected. It's a very interesting piece of research. If you get a chance, you can check out our blog, learn a little bit more about that one. Also, Meetup security flaws exposed 44 million members to data loss and payment threat. And then hackers, this was an interesting one about this time last year. Actually, I think it was around RSA last year, where the vacuum cleaner, one of those little robot vacuums around the house, and had a little camera on it for some reason, had a camera on it. And our researchers were very easily able to utilize some API vulnerabilities to gain access to the camera manufacturer's cloud. And next thing you know, we had access to basically every vacuum cleaner's camera around the globe. So some very interesting research. And we have, like I said, we have that team that's focusing on sort of consumer devices and also websites and et cetera. And then we have another research team that's really focusing on the open source vulnerabilities. For example, a cross-site scripting vulnerability discovered in Mozilla Bleach. And this is just a very, very small sample of the things that these great researchers are doing. The Apache Unomi, another remote code execution vulnerability. Drupal core behind the vulnerability. This was another stored cross-site scripting and self cross-site scripting vulnerabilities there. And then Twitter server, again, open source server, Twitter, set it up. Next thing you know, it's vulnerable right out of the box. Cross-site scripting vulnerability discovered is there. So what our researchers do is we work very, very closely with these organizations, and we do a responsible disclosure according to many of their bug bounty programs, and we operate under those programs as well. And really, I think the whole message here is it's just elevating the security awareness of these organizations, and then also providing protection mechanisms, especially for these open source vulnerabilities inside of our SCA product. All right, so James, are you ready to go?
Indeed, I am.
All right, let me switch the presenter over to you and verifying the presenter change. So you should see a little pop-up came up. All right, got your slide deck.
Cool. Are we in presentation mode here?
I see your slide deck, but not the present. I see the deck, but not in the, which is, so if you want to, it may be selecting your different monitor. Okay, there you go. Looks like you're good.
Good?
Yeah. Up. It was good. Now I'm seeing your presenter mode. No worries. There you go. Now I see the little slide.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
So yeah, with Checkmarks, you definitely want to get a bird's eye view. When someone kind of first comes to any kind of SCA vendor, they're really focused on kind of small things. They want to know, hey, is this specific type of vulnerability found? What should I do? But really, you want to take a step back and make sure that you can get a bird's-eye perspective of your application, and not only just a specific application, but many applications throughout your organization. From an enterprise, mentality, you might have thousands of repos and thousands of projects. So you want to have a very well formed dashboard that's going to show you, the vulnerabilities in projects itself, but maybe even projects that are specific to, different projects or packages. So really, to have a risk dashboard, that's something that you're really going to want to look into as having, not only as from a vendor perspective, but also just because you're going to have to show, your CISO, or or if you are a CISO, you're going to want to see this type of report itself. A great feature that a lot of SCA vendors have is also being alerted when a new vulnerability is found. So just because if I scan something a week ago doesn't mean that vulnerability can be found during that time. So to have an automatic feature or automatic alerting feature where you either receive a Slack message or an email, this is going to be pretty big when a big type of vulnerability pops up that's found in the open source community. To see vulnerabilities that trends over time is very important for any kind of tool you're using to make sure that when you start off somewhere, you're decreasing all the vulnerabilities over time. And you really want a good database of known CVEs. And if you don't know what a CVE is, that is something that is publicly known about an open source project. So someone submits a CVE or an organization submits a CVE that's attached to a open source project. It's attached to the version number of that open source project, and if it's been fixed or if it's being fixed in a specific release. So it's good that an SCA vendor can pull those from multiple kind of databases, but also find and identify their own ones. An example of something that might be their own might be, hey, someone posted something in GitHub that this is not working for this version, but it hasn't been created, a CVE has not been created for it yet. So researchers and SCA vendors will go in and compile a list of things they see in email list or GitHub pull requests, various different types of sources, and then they can put that together and create their own database with their non-CVEs. So these are all kind of good things to kind of look at. We talk about being accurate. So a way of being very accurate is by reading the manifest file that's actually pulling in those packages. So there's a couple different ways an SCA tool can work. You can either look at that manifest file, or it can go look at the fingerprints of the file itself and identify, hey, this is coming from this version of this open source project. That's not the most accurate solution. The most accurate solution definitely is to pull the packages in the manifest file so you know exactly the packages that are being pulled in. All right, so part of being a good SCA vendor tool as well is being able to identify exactly where these packages are coming from. So there's a transitive property that's happening when you pull in a package. So let's just say you want to pull in package A. You might be pulling in hundreds of packages because you're trying to pull in this package A, or you may be pulling in a couple different packages. And just because the vulnerability is not found in the package you're trying to pull in, it might be coming in from part of that transitive property where you're pulling in A, B, C, and D, and the actual vulnerability is actually found in D. So to save you a lot of time going through the triage process, you definitely want to make sure that this tool will actually show you that, hey, this package is being pulled in because you're trying to pull in package A. So you really want to understand where it's coming from. You want to understand what component actually needs to be remediated. And it's very helpful to have this in a visual setting. Everyone's very used to seeing a kind of a tree structure. So you can actually see the kind of tree where it's actually coming from and all the packages that are associated with it. I think, Stephen, you mentioned something really important too, like early in the conversation is, open source should not be a scary conversation. It should not be hey, we are against using open source, because that's not the mentality of, of modern applications right now. Really, you want to embrace it. You want to be able to manage the risk and not really necessarily eliminate the risk itself. So it's very important to embrace open source, live in this agile mentality, this agile world. It does save a lot of time. It's been tested for the most part in the field. So, there's more trust being gained in the open source tools, and the more people contribute, the more people are using it, the more vulnerabilities that people will know, and also be able to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, James. I actually live in Florida, right? So, Florida hurricanes, right? And we know that they're coming, and we know that the risk is high, and we know that it's literally inevitable. And so what do? We manage that risk. First and foremost, when you know a hurricane's coming, you tie up all the furniture in your backyard and all the projectiles, things that will become projectiles, you get rid of that first. But then you build your house with the proper windows and the proper roof structure and the proper this and the proper that. And not every structure can stand a massive hurricane, but what we've done is just effectively manage the risk. Otherwise, nobody would live in Florida, right? So it's the same thing around open source. We're going to use it. We love it. It's enjoyable. It makes things faster, make things better. It streamlines lots of different things. But I think if we just accept that there is a risk and we manage the risk effectively, at the end of the day, I think we're going to be a lot better off.
I think that's a great analogy, and I never really thought about that. And in that same analogy, you've identified things that might be at risk during that hurricane. So maybe you have a weak garage, or you have maybe your car is not parked somewhere. So you've kind of the weak spots, and that's kind of the most important thing about having this SCA tool, is that you can identify your weak spots and where you can be exploited. So I think that's a great analogy, and I'm going to actually steal that sometime.
You got it, man.
I'm gonna use it as an earthquake, because I live in San Francisco, so we're always
one of the, yeah, exactly. This week, I think there's big, snowstorms in Texas and everything. There's risk no matter where you live.
That's true. All right, so if you've experienced SCA in the past, one of the hardest problems really is identifying, hey, am I even using these exploitable findings that this tool is giving me? So, for example, there might be a known CVE that says, hey, if you're using this API, or if you're using this component in this specific way, then you're gonna be, you could have your code be exploitable. And then it took hours, sometimes days, to go through the code, to have somebody go through the code. Not every security engineer is very familiar with every language or how the source code actually works. You might have to pull off an engineer off the project to see how, if you're actually using it. And it really took away a lot of time towards the development. So with Exploitable Path, you can now figure out, hey, am I even using this CVE, this known CVE, in a way that can make my application exploitable? And that can really cut down on the triage time. It can also prioritize some of the findings. So, if the remediation advice is to upgrade your software, upgrade the package, but maybe you don't need to, because, hey, maybe you're not even using it in this path. So this is one of the great new features that SCA vendors tools has, and that what Checkmarks has too, is be able to identify that, hey, am I using the CV in a way that can be exploitable? And then here is the exact code flow that you can help triage and give to developers as much information as possible, so they know that, hey, this is a serious risk. They learn more about security vulnerabilities, because now they can see it in their code. So you're teaching your developers exactly what security vulnerability is by showing them that path, because that's how developers think. They think of it as, as some kind of stack trace. So this is a really great way of not only teaching developers, but also, knowing that if you're using something or not. So you have, inside of your, inside of the UI, you'll have the actual code itself, you'll have the open source code, and then the actual vulnerable function. So it acts like a call stack. If you're familiar with computer science at all, kind of like the beginning of where the data is coming in, and then where it's coming out. So it's also great to get some kind of remediation guidance. So, hey, what do I need to do? Do I need to upgrade this package to solve this issue? And that's most of the time is, hey, I need to upgrade this package, but you also need to know what version you should upgrade to, because it's not necessarily best practice to upgrade to the latest version, because as what Steven said before was, hey, it hasn't been tested the most, hasn't been in the field. It might have that fixed in there, but you might be open up to way more security risk by having this package. So really, you'll get some remediation advice of getting the best stable version of that package, which is something that the security team and the open source team of that package will maintain and let you know, hey, this is the latest stable version. So it's not always the best advice to go to the latest version. It's the best advice to go to the latest stable version.
That's a good point.
So you can see here that, we recommend to go to some certain version. It shows the exploitable path. It gives you detailed information of exactly what that CVE is telling you, or what the SCA vendor has found in some kind of GitHub discussion. So something that's not talked about that much when it comes to the SCA, space, is also managing licenses. Every open source is going to have a different license attached to their package. I remember a while ago, Cisco had a huge one that was in there, and it ended up costing them $1 million, millions of dollars to take it out, to actually pay the patent off, and also to completely redesign their source code for it. So to identify licenses as early as possible is crucial. And so when we're talking about, finding licensing issues, finding these security vulnerabilities issues, it really has the shift left mentality of software development. You want to identify these type of vulnerabilities and licenses issues as soon as possible, and not only find them and automate them into your SDLC or into your DevOps, but also integrate the results back in. So I really recommend having the scanning done as soon as possible, usually inside the SCM itself. So, some kind of event happens, such as a push or a pull request or a merge request, or possibly a push into the main branch, is when you want to automatically initiate these type of scans for SCA. And not only that, but you want to integrate those results back into the SCM itself as well. So not only can you integrate the results into the SCM, you can integrate the results into Jira or your bug tracking tool as well. So these things are automatically being shown to your developers, so they know at real time what packages they're pulling in, and if these vulnerabilities if there's known vulnerabilities in those packages at that time. So really, I recommend a couple different things. Have it early as possible inside your SCM, either using GitHub Actions or the GitLab CI, or even in Jenkins, where it's going off of a pull request. Pushing those results back into the SCM, so back into the pull request, have those results there. And if someone ends up pushing it into their main branch, then create some Jira tickets. And it's not enough just to create those Jira tickets. What you really want to do is to manage those Jira tickets in an automated way that, hey, if another scan happens and someone has updated this package, I want to close that ticket as well. So it's a full feedback channel and loop where you can automatically create tickets and automatically close tickets. And that's something that Checkmarks does too as well. But that's kind of an important workflow, because then if you don't have that type of workflow, you're just gonna suffocate your bug tracking system. You're going to create a bunch of tickets and they're not up to date. So it's really important to have some kind of automated workflow where it's closing tickets as well. When you think about having an SCA vendor, you really want to know if it fits the source code and the package managers you use. So for example, if your code is a Java code base and you use POM-XMLs for Maven, then you want to find a vendor that fulfills, the Java and the Maven requirements that you have. So as you kind of go through and determine what kind of vendor you want, make sure that they fit the languages, and more importantly, the package managers, because the package managers is the thing that's going to have the manifest file, and that's really where you get the most accurate scans is by having the SCA read that manifest file, be able to understand the package manager that's being used to build the application itself. Some integration points is always Jenkins and maybe even a CLI, but Azure DevOps is listed here, but it's really more of a broad SCM. So in GitHub and GitLab, Bitbucket, you want to have that integration that that Checkmarks provides as well, where you have the results that can start from the SCM and put them back into the SCM as well. Because developers, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, James, because I know you do lots of demonstrations. You work with a lot of various customers, clients, as well as our integration partners, bringing that all together. And, because what we're trying to achieve is having that integration. And once we have integration, then we can achieve automation, right? You can't achieve automation without the integration piece, right? And so I know you do a lot of work with lots of different organizations on the integration piece.
Yeah, and most organizations, they want the developers to stay within one tool. They want to stay within one environment. Right. They don't really care the name of the vendor. They just care about the results. So having, if they're using GitHub, have the results back into GitHub. Have them create inside the pull request, or have them create GitHub issues. So they're staying within their SCM and not leaving. So that's a great point, is that you have that integration done inside of that ecosystem of the SCM. You still want to provide, the security dashboards for the security team, and have all of that, all the nice kind of workflows. But when it comes down to developers consuming the data, they like two different things. They either want it inside the pull request or the SCM, or they want it as a bug itself.
Yeah, good point.
So just to kind of give a short kind of workflow on how it works. So you have an agent, and you have a web application with the UI. You have the databases with all the CVEs, the known CVEs are out there, and even the private ones that the SCA vendors will maintain. And all of it is kind of in a SaaS mentality. So it's all going towards the database is in the cloud, the UI is in the cloud, the agent itself is on-prem. So the agent itself can send either the manifest file to the cloud, or if you need to do the exploitable path, it can actually do the source code as well. The results look up the results inside of it. It reads the manifest file that's been pushed into the cloud. It determines all the packages, all the package version numbers, and then it can look up in the database, hey, give me all the known CVEs for this package and for this specific version as well. The results are then put into the web application UI itself, or it can be pushed back to the premise and shown in the SCM or bug tracking tools that I mentioned before. So really, a couple key things I do want to kind of emphasize again is, when do you want to do this? When do you want to scan using SCA? You want to scan as early as possible. I recommend during the pull request or the merge request itself. How do you want to integrate? You want to integrate with the SCM itself as well. You want to put the results back in there on pull request or merge request. You want to push it to your bug tracking if they pushed into the actual main branch. And you want to have the bug tracking automated. It's not good enough just to create tickets, but you also want to close those tickets if someone has actually fixed it in the source code itself and it's not in there anymore. So if there's another scan that happens, it's not found, you want to close those tickets as well. So there's a closed feedback loop itself. And that's all I needed to show, and we can go into any kind of questions that people might have.
Well, one thing real quick before we get into the questions, James, is that, when we really consider that the statistics we're demonstrating from ESG is that, half of the organizations out there today are looking for some sort of SCA solution, right? And what we try to show you here today is really about the things that you should consider when looking at an SCA solution. A lot of people had originally SCA years ago was all about license management, license control. And that was one of the very first implementations or actual use cases of an SCA solution. But today we realize that there's a lot more than the license, right? We got to deal with the vulnerabilities. We also have to deal, with the technical debt, right, of these packages or whatever no longer being well maintained by the community. And so when you're really considering an SCA solution, I think there's so many factors that you have to consider. And hopefully, we've showed some of these factors that should obviously percolate to the top when you're actually considering what you're going to do next around the open source in your own code base. So I think we got some questions that have been coming in. I think James, you want to go ahead and
I'm having a hard time reading some of them.
okay, no, I think Dave, do you got some questions coming, Dave?
Yeah, we do. First, I would just obviously want to remind everyone that now is the time, if they want to ask a question and have you guys answer it, that they should be submitting it now. One person wrote a question that was talking about the difficulty in finding open source code within their, in their infrastructure. Even going so far as to say they can't even tell who's used open source code in the tools that they've purchased to buy. So what would be the best approach for them to kind of get a handle on all this? I know you just went through a lot of that, but perhaps you can hit some of the high notes for this attendee.
Yeah, as long as you're using, for the SCA really focuses mostly on the open source tools you're bringing in, and not necessarily always the perpetual license or the other software tools you're bringing in. But if you want to know the open source that you are bringing in your application, you definitely need to use an SCA tool that can read through all the different software all the different projects that you have. And that's really kind of, what the SCA tool itself does.
And that dovetails nicely with the next question, which is, what's the best approach to convince my organization that we need an SCA solution?
Yeah, the way I would talk about it is, how do you currently do it now? And the answer to that, most people, if they're not using a SCA tool, the answer I get back is, oh, we're using a spreadsheet of some sort, and that's how we kind of manage it. But then how do you manage it when like something like Apache struts comes along? When there's a huge kind of vulnerability that's found, how do you know what open source packages you have? Some scary things that I see too is, not only do people have a lot of open source packages they don't know, and then they panic when it happens that some kind of breach has happened, but a lot of people have different versions of the same package, and that kind of drives me a little bit mad, because if you have a version of OpenSSL, 10 different versions of OpenSSL, then you can have different vulnerabilities all over your source code itself. So when something like Heartbleed happens for OpenSSL or Apache struts, you need to know exactly if you have it and exactly the projects that are using it. That's the way that's how I would bring it up to my CISO, at least, is like, hey, we're managing it on this spreadsheet. It's not updated. We have no idea really what's going in there. It's just kind of a big mess. We need some way of knowing what's in there and knowing if we're exploitable at all.
Good. Okay. We have another question that just came in from an attendee, and it says, in terms of vulnerability prioritization for remediation, do you have any best practice recommendations?
Yeah, I would definitely filter on severity. So all CVEs have a score between 0 and 10 and are considered high, medium, or low. I would only focus on the high ones. I would filter on those, and then I would take those and prioritize it by exploitable path and see if, hey, am I actually even using these? If I am, those would be the higher priority. And then below that, I would then have them lower prioritize the other ones that are still high findings, have those as lower priorities, because they might not even be affecting your application, and work from there.
Great. So I know you've mentioned the exploitable path many times. The next question is, can you provide more details on the exploitable path capabilities within Checkmarks SCA?
Yeah, so basically we can determine if you're using the actual source, if the source code is actually using the open source package, through our exploitable path, it's looking at the source code, it's looking at the tree DOM, so it's using a little bit of SAS in that scenario. But yeah, for further details, it's a long conversation to have. So I would definitely recommend either having a demo for it and working along the lines of that.
Yeah, another option too is for the audience, if they want to learn a little bit more about the exploitable path with a relationship to Checkmarks SAST and how we actually utilize the Checkmarks SAST, and building in the abstract syntax tree, and then utilizing the ASD query language, and with our CX query capabilities. There's a couple blogs that are sitting out that we just released a week or so ago, and from one of our researchers, Alex, on our SEA research team. And so I would definitely recommend digesting those, because there's some pretty cool stuff that you can learn about how we're actually utilizing our actual Checkmarks SAST to scan the source code, and then tying those results or utilizing that in conjunction with our software composition analysis solution. And so you can see the synergies between the two products. And why that's really important is because we can identify that exploitable path. And the whole idea, James, is that if you're using something that's not exploitable, the whole point of that is that you don't really have to spend the time trying to remediate something that you're not necessarily vulnerable to. Is that a correct analysis, James?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. So I have a question, and that is, if people are using another SaaS solution, can Checkmarks SCA still work with that, or what is the compatibility?
Most likely no, but again, we can. That's a question that needs a little bit more detail, I guess.
Okay, so we can move on. How does Checkmarks SCA compare to other open source security solutions on the market?
Very broad question.
It is.
It's kind of a hardball.
Yeah, it's an enterprise solution. We have, Checkmarks has the same features as every other SCA tool. I think the big advantage of what we have is kind of an all-in-one type of solution where we have, not only can we have an umbrella of your SAST and your SCA, but with IaaS as well. So not only do we have every single feature that all the other vendors have, but we also provide the SaaS service as well.
Mm-hmm. So how do you guys license the SCA solution?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer for. That would have to be through sales. I believe the short answer is I believe it's through how many projects are being scanned, but that is more of a sales question.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we're at the end of the questions apparently. So if you'd like, I give you about 30 seconds. Perhaps you can highlight the key takeaway that our attendees should keep top of mind as they leave the webinar today.
Yeah, actually, if you want to learn more about Checkmarks and kind of what we're doing, also following our research, definitely check us out and follow us on LinkedIn. You can check out our blog. We're always having something new coming from our research teams, pretty much on a weekly, if not monthly basis, which is some pretty interesting stuff coming out of there as well. We also have a very interesting open source security ebook, which is free for download. You can go to our website and certainly grab that. And it's really more geared toward those decision makers and having them understand why SCA is imperative. And it was written around the precept that, look, SCA is important. What type of approaches are we going to take to, or open source security is important. What type of approaches are we going to take to, to manage our risk? And then if you want to learn more, especially from James and the rest of our team on the technical side, you can definitely request a personal demo. We could walk you through all of the features and functionalities of the product and even describe how best we could fit within your current environment so that you can automate and integrate and automate the solution very effectively in what your developers are doing daily. So any last comments, James?
Yeah, I guess I just repeat what I said before is like, don't be scared of open source, really embrace it. It's just important to manage the risks. You're not going to eliminate all the risks, but you just definitely want to manage the risks, would be my takeaway.
compliant.
Excellent. All right. Well, Stephen and James, thank you so much for a very informative presentation today. I think people will leave here with more knowledge of open source security than they came in with. Certainly would like to thank Checkmarks for sponsoring today's webinar. And of course, thanks to all the attendees who joined us here today and hung in for the duration. Appreciate that. So until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now.